Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Abdelhak Bassou, and I'm Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South. On behalf of Mr. Karim Lainawi, President of the Policy Center for the New South, I would like to welcome you and hope that everyone is in good health, especially in these difficult times impacted by the effects of COVID-19, a pandemic that forces us to communicate from a distance. The subjects you will be dealing with today and tomorrow is another scourge that also threatens health, social cohesion, economies, and undermines development efforts. Drugs and related trafficking are a lever for transnational organized crime and the tool used by mafias to destroy the economies of countries and enslave generations of human beings, and can thus control countries or lead them to bankruptcy and disorder. The money from this trafficking has also proven to be a medium for international terrorism. The discussion of this subject is timely and therefore proves relevant here in Morocco, as the kingdom is preparing to enact a law on the cultivation of cannabis, not only to control this matter, but above all, to make it an instrument of development. The project of Bill 13-21 intends to create a national agency to make cannabis a raw material which, while creating a new agricultural sector, will strengthen the pharmaceutical industry within a legal and controlled framework. On the other hand, work in this issue falls within the domain of public policy, a subject inscribed in the DNA of the Policy Center for the New South, whose research aims to innovate in terms of public policies to manage the new society, the new issues, and new societal trend and change. Once again, thank you in advance for your efforts, for your participation, and the innovative ideas through which you will enrich the reflection in this subject. I wish you a good continuation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bassou. It was an honor to have you introduce in this discussion, and it's an honor for me to follow up, of course, with the brief introductory words on behalf of the copy editors of the special issue on drug policies and development, conflict or coexistence. I would very much like to thank the Policy Center for the New South for providing us with this platform, with this incredible platform, and with so much expertise. And I would, of course, like to thank the International Development Policy Journal, DEFPOL, who also have been a wonderful platform for us to do it, and the organization I work for, the Global Commission, for making it all, for getting it all together. I would very much also, just very briefly, to thank the co-editors to this piece. We have with us today, I'm very glad to introduce her, Professor Julia Buxton, the global professor for criminology at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. And I've been very honored to co-edit this special issue with Julia and with Professor Julia, and also with Dr. Mary Chineri Hesse from the West African Commission on Drugs and from the University of Ghana. I would, of course, like to thank all the authors for the work they've been doing, but also the two colleagues that have joined us today, Jason Eli Mregoretti and Dr. Razrazi from the Policy Center. Just very briefly, where the special issue came from. As Mr. Bassou just said, this is a very large issue that concerns security, that concerns public health, that concerns fundamental rights and development. So we were looking at it from a larger, how do we look from a larger framework, and how do we look into all the issues and all the areas and policy areas that are being really impacted by current drug control, and why aren't we successful in doing better to some extent. And so the political dimensions, the civil dimensions, economic, social, cultural, and it was all within the lens of development to some extent and of sustainable development. And so from there, we knew that we knew that this was not working and something was going wrong with drug control around the world because of the outcomes on public health, on fundamental rights, on security, where failure was there. And where would the solutions be for a cross-cutting issue and an issue that has this nature of cross-cutting? So very briefly, the first part looks really into poverty eradication, into what is alternative development and how does it help develop in the communities, as Mr. Bessou was talking about, for example, of the cultivators that exist in Morocco and in many, many, many other countries that produce plant-based drugs. It's also about sustainable development and making sure that this the challenges that are upcoming, such as the legalization for different purposes, how do you respond to that and make sure that there's fair trade that provides for the people that are on the ground. So those are, you will find there about 5 chapters that are very innovative. We have a specific example from Afghanistan from one of the biggest researchers on Afghanistan, David Mansfield. We have, of course, a wonderful introductory article by Professor Buxton here, and that explains very well what alternative development is and what has brought. This special issue also brought in its second part of something very interesting that Mr. Bessou has been really talking about in the introduction, and which will be part also of the discussion in the upcoming panel, which is about the political nature of drugs. And to some extent, there we had Tuesday Ritano from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, talking about illicit financial flows and talking about how drug control helps or does not help in situations of conflicts and where it doesn't work and what needs to be done. We have there, of course, a comment piece by the executive director of the International Drug Policy Consortium, who speaks about who are the right holders, who are the participants, and who are the shareholders, and who are the stakeholders. How do you involve people that consume drugs? How do you involve traditional farmers? How do you involve civil society and voices within the whole scheme of things? We have also an interview with the former president of Timor-Leste and Nobel Peace Prize, José Ramos Horta, who speaks about his role when he was himself special envoy of the Secretary General of the United Nations to Guinea-Bissau. And he speaks about the narco states terminology used for Guinea-Bissau. He speaks about the use of death penalty in Southeast Asia, where he is from. And we have an article by myself, humbly, on the impact of political emotion, of the use of drug policies on political participation and competition. Now, in the third part of this, and the last part of this special issue that you could have, which is in open access, and thank you for the open access to international development policy and for the possibility of having that. So there you also can see that we have, to some extent, the cross-cutting issues, big policy issues that we have. We have had the huge pleasure of having a very innovative article by Dr. Kenza Afsahi, who is a Moroccan citizen and working in Université de Bordeaux, who talks about the environmental impact of massive production of cannabis and doing comparative analysis between the north of Morocco and certain parts of California in the United States. We also have the gendered impacts that we will be speaking about tomorrow in the second panel of this event. There's the children's rights also tomorrow, and there's also what does it mean? Why is drug policy also for people that consume a health issue, and why for society it is also a health issue, with also an example on South Africa. So this piece altogether is very innovative because it goes away from that dichotomy of either focusing on demand reduction or either focusing on supply reduction and analyzing that as if they were very separate to some extent, and really taking the central role using development policies as the basis of analysis and touching upon all the different dimensions of development. Thank you very much.
First of all, thanks to the promoters of this exercise, and thank you for the four panelists that will address the issue at hand. Let me, at the outset, welcome our four panelists and welcome also our audience. This first session that I have the honor to chair will address the challenges and the complexities of drug policies in time of peace building. And we all know that the peace building is a very difficult juncture where peace can become sustainable and enduring peace, but when peace also can be reversible. As a factor that can complicate or even exacerbate conflicts, drug policies represent a real challenge to government. Our four panelists who will address this nexus from different angles, from different lenses, and will address them specifically on some African regions, will try to enlighten us on different dimensions of this scourge, as it was put by President Karim El-Ainawi. To frame our discussion, let me share with you some key questions that come to mind. First, how government can manage to reconcile combating drug trafficking with promoting national reconciliation and reintegration, which represent a very important and vital and decisive step in any peace building. Second question, what initiatives and what measures national government can take to gain the trust of the population and mitigate the effects of drug policies on vulnerable populations. Third question, what the international community represented by the Security Council mainly and the donors countries can do more to support government in promoting their drug policies. And finally, this is just an indicative questions, because I know that the complexities of this issue call for a lot of questioning. So my last question would be, to what extent the legalization process that were referred to also in the introductory remarks can be a game changer in combating the scourge of drug trafficking. To help us understand better the stakes and the challenges, I would like to call upon successively Julia Baxton, Anna Maria Coretti-Loglo, Jason Elig, and Dr. Mustafa Rezrazi. Let me very briefly, and I don't think that what I'm going to say will do justice to our four panelists, but for the sake of not using too much time, let me just introduce briefly our four panelists. Julia Baxton is a senior research associate at the Global Drug Policy Observatory in Swinson University. She is a specialist on Latin America. She holds a PhD from London School of Economics, and she is a well-known expert on democratizations, disarmament, reintegration, and conflict analysis. Anna Maria Loglo is an African consultant for International Drug Policy Consortium. She is a well-known and well-respected expert on the drug control and human rights. She is an author of so many articles. She graduated from the University of Ghana. Mr. Jason Elig is a senior expert at the Global Initiative Against Transnational organized crime. He is an analyst in area of drug market. He led technical cooperation initiative on illicit drug in Africa and Asia. And finally, Mr. Razrazi El Mustafa, he is professor of crisis management, security studies goes from terrorism to radicalization, de-radicalization. She holds a PhD from the University of Japan, Tokyo. And he is a well-known expert on extremism and violence. He is the coordinator of the OBOR China-Moroccan Research Group, and he is a member of the advisory board of Euro-African Studies Institute, among other responsibilities. Well, even if it is brief, I think these brief presentation give us an idea about the in-depth knowledge of our four experts, and undoubtedly we will benefit from their contribution. So without much ado, I will give the floor to Julia, Ms. Julia Baxton. We agreed that we will have between 5 and 7 minutes. So if you can wrap up your remarks in a maximum of 7 minutes, it will be very helpful so that we can at the end of this presentation. So you have the floor, Julia. Please go ahead.
Ambassador Lulichki, thank you very much to the Centre for hosting us. Obviously, it's very timely for us to be talking about the incompatibilities between drug policy and peace building, as we learn that Colombia, with the support now of the US government, as outlined by Secretary of State Blinken, will be reinventing the wheel in cocaine policy. Colombia is going back to the 1980s, supported by the United States, and reverting to a coercive approach that has historically failed in Colombia to contain illicit cocaine markets. Colombia is proposing to establish a new counter-narcotics force with 7,000 personnel and to restart glyphosate spraying. Now, this reversion back to tried, tested and failed policies in the middle of what is supposed to be a peace-building process is despite clear evidence that illicit coca cultivation is driven by informality and marginalization. This is despite the commitment to delivering development assistance on the part of the Colombian government that was set out in the 2016 peace accords, and also despite the shocking revelations that the Colombian military carried out at least 6,400 extrajudicial killings and presented them as combat deaths between 2002 and 2008. So in this context of ongoing violence, assassinations of human rights defenders, Colombia is going back to an approach that's over 30 years old, and which actually has seen cocaine prices collapse and coca cultivation zones expand. So Colombia for us is a really good case study, a really good example of this interrelationship between illicit drug economies, peace and development. But what we try and do in this special edition is reverse this and instead try and understand the relationship between counter-narcotics policies, insecurity and underdevelopment. Now, there was a broad consensus among authors that criminalisation, even in its most punitive and draconian form, has failed. It's not ended illicit drug markets. It's not reduced the violence or the insecurity around illicit markets. And instead, as has been outlined, it simply generated these vast untaxed revenues and distorted local economies and caused immense public health harms. But our key emphasis here is that state-led eradication and interdiction programs, which are intended to deal with these illicit drug economies, catastrophically undermine development and peace prospects, and particularly for some of the most vulnerable, impoverished and marginalized people on this planet. So our concern is, how do we realize sustainable development goals in this context in which we have this emphasis on violence and coercive counter-narcotics? And what we try and highlight are the major incompatibilities between coercive drug policies, development processes and peace building. Three key points that I would just take away really from the emphasis on peace building we have here in this time that I have for this presentation. We traditionally focus on places like Afghanistan, Peru, Colombia, Myanmar, where we've had this nexus between drug crop cultivation, conflict and violence. As Tuesday Retaino reminds us in this special edition, there are major transformations now in illicit drug markets, shifts towards synthetic drugs, changing locations of drug manufacture and production. What this is doing is alerting us to the damaging dangers of counter-narcotics policies, not just in traditional cultivation zones, but in new manufacturing zones, Western East Africa, Central America, Central Asia, where this dynamic of drug violence is instead linked to urbanization and organized and disorganized crime. So my first takeaway, really, my first emphasis is that we really have to broaden our understanding of peace building. Peace building cannot simply be focused only on these kind of high-scale conflict countries. We have to focus down and look at peace building in our communities and the damage that counter-narcotics is causing in these urban environments. The second thing, very quickly, is what we've highlighted in the special edition, as Khaled has mentioned, is this emphasis on trying to provide alternative economic sources for rural communities in conflict contexts. Now, we discuss alternative developments and alternative livelihoods. We have an excellent contribution from our colleagues at GIZ. Personally, my chapter and my focus here is that alternative development is really a form of policy bricolage. It's really unworkable within a prohibition paradigm. You cannot have efforts to create alternative livelihoods in the ongoing context of repression, coercion, and criminalization, because these fundamental distortions will persist. I really emphasize to you, please, to read the chapter by David Mansfield in this special edition, which is really highlighting the contradiction between drug policy and peace building, because so many of the peace building experiments we've seen recently in narcotic contexts have been what we would call a negative peace. What they've tried to do is alleviate the immediate manifestations of conflict, but the problem is at the same time, they're not addressing the structural drivers of violence in the first place. And the main reason for this, I would argue, is that it's very important to get the main protagonists around the table of peace negotiations. But the problem is, so often the protagonists are the key actors in the drug trade. And this frequently includes the state. It frequently includes the security sector. So the peace processes that we're seeing are actually very negative peace, in which what we're seeing happen is the institutionalization of vested interests in an illicit economy. So until we have this process of decriminalization, really meaningful alternatives to the opportunities that are provided in conflict and poor contexts, but in a formal sector, then we're going to have no meaningful progress on peace building. The final point I would emphasize is that peace building and these kind of counter-narcotic strategies are completely incompatible, because drug policies, criminalization-based drug policies, empower the security sector. They reduce effective oversight. They impede meaningful democratization. So this in turn erodes popular and public confidence in peace processes and in democratic participation. And the really important aspect here is that meaningful peace needs resources. Counter-narcotic strategies are hugely expensive, and they are detracting revenues that are needed for structural change, for poverty alleviation, and for addressing the drivers of conflict. Final point, unfortunately, we tend to see that the drug policy community and the development community do not work together. They don't work together effectively. And as a result of this, we have sustained unconnected strategies in some of the most vulnerable areas of the world. I'd like to hand over to my colleagues, Jason and Maria, who will no doubt provide a more African nuanced focus here for us, but really to emphasize that in the edited collection for us, peace building and drug policy are fundamentally contradictory. And I hope I've provided some slight highlights as to why that may be the case. Thank you.
And very direct to the point. I see your criticism about coming back to the coercive approach and not integrating the sustainable development dimension, which posed the question, I think, of prioritization of the objectives and maybe the sequencing of what needs to be done to really achieve sustainable peace out of the peace-building times. Let me turn now to Anne-Maria Loglo. You have the floor to enlighten us about your African experience and what is your take when it comes to addressing drug trafficking in times of peace building. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can hear you now. There was a little break. Thank you very much. And thank you, my co-panelists and the organizers of this session. I'm really happy to be here today to share the perspective of West Africa. And as we all know, West Africa has been in the frontier of this whole discussion about drug trafficking and terrorist funding and all that. And we know that we have been exploited for a long time. But what we have witnessed in the last decades is that there is an increase in the volume of drugs passing through the region. And this is not because this has not happened. I mean, this hasn't been happening. But what is happening now is that the traditional routes are being policed more heavily. And so the traffickers now try to find alternative routes through the region that is conducive for their activities. Of course, there has been a lot of discussion about terrorists, the relationship between terrorists and funding and that of drug trafficking, which has really deepened the conversation, especially among governments, about the need to intensify the war on drugs. A typical example is what is happening in Nigeria with the Boko Haram. Now, what many of us, in terms of the narrative that is going on, is that we have tried to link drug trafficking and terrorist funding to the issue of drugs, and that they are the sole funders of the terrorist activities within the sub-region. But I will always say that to describe this link of drug trafficking and terrorism funding, it's more or less an opportunistic way of describing the issue. Because if you look at the two, they are not the same organization. For instance, if you look at the work of West Africa Commission on Drugs, they also sought to kind of try to find out what is actually the link between the two and what could be done in terms of government's focus in addressing the specific issue. And what they found out was that drug trafficking wasn't a sole or a primary source of funding for these Boko Haram and all those terrorist activities that are happening in the region. What I actually found out was a little bit interesting. They found out that the traffickers sort of use the terrorist group as a cover because of proximity, to cover up so that they can use it to move their drugs from one location to the other. What they also found out was that these groups are easily, I mean, sometimes compensated, or sometimes what we see is that they just kind of like, because of the proximity, they are just used as a cover up for attention to be drawn on the terrorist activities other than what the drug traffickers are doing within the region. Now, if you look at the Boko Haram and all those activities that are going on, you will realize that the main primary funding for most of these activities of these terrorists is the fish business. What we have discovered is that they are in charge of the Lake Chad Basin. And for a very long time, they have taken control of the business, and that is what they are getting their major funding from. And so it is a conversation that we need to begin to look at the appropriate issues and the core issues that we need to address. What we need to appreciate is that the whole conversation should be that, of course, there is demand, of course, there is supply, but we need to stop trying to end both situations. That is supply reduction, demand reduction. We have had governments who have made calls that they have to end the, we want drugs-free Africa. And so attempts to have a drugs-free Africa has deepened the war on drugs and the kind of policies we have legislated over years to try to address this problem. What we need to know is that the fundamental goal of drug policy should be to improve health, safety, security, and the socioeconomic well-being of the people that we are being, put in place as governments to address or to help. So in this reason, it is important that we begin to look at it from a different perspective, other than the mindset that we want to end the war on drugs And so all attempts and all efforts is geared towards using mechanisms that will eliminate drugs completely on the face of this. It is impossible for us to be able to eliminate drugs completely. These have been with us through existence of humanity. And of course, we need to coexist with these substances and manage them and address them appropriately. And one of the problems we as a region have faced for a long time is that the focus has been more on security. It's more security driven than looking at the other variables that impact the lives of the people. We spend so much huge money in trying to address the problem of the security aspect, neglecting the development, the health, the safety, and the economic well-being of the people. Many of the people who cultivate cannabis do so in my region, for instance. A lot of them do so because of economic reasons, to be able to depend on that for livelihood, sustainability, and all that. So as a region, we need to begin to look at a shift towards a more cross-cutting issue in addressing the problem. Like the previous speaker rightly said, you cannot discuss the issue of peace when there are some fundamental issues that you have neglected in addressing the problem. Drug policy has been isolated and treated in a certain way, that as if drug policy sits in a different silo and that of peace building sits in a different silo. We need to begin to see how these two interrelate. And I am always of the view that for us as a region to be able to address this fundamental issue, we need a shift that takes into consideration all the issues that matter in the conversation of drugs. And finally, I would like to reiterate that this discussion and the reform issues is very pivotal, especially in our region, because West Africa as a region is with the highest demographic increase. We have weak states, corruption issues, blurred lines, and of course between licit and illicit, and many foreign interests in terms of whatever is happening in the region. So it is time for us to begin to build a new drug policy that works for the region. From the north, south, east, governments must begin to channel resources towards providing quality health services for people who use drugs, and ensure that there's adequate accessibility for those who need these kind of services. We also need to invest in the well-being of our citizens and not just watch so much in terms of arguments that we want a drug-free Africa, and also we have to ensure.
I see that she joined Julia in establishing the fact that the security-driven approach has again proved its failure to address the nexus, peace building, and drug policies. What I find original in what she said is that she is trying to promote the idea that we have to coexist with, to a certain extent, with drug trafficking, and we have to adopt a holistic approach which could combine not only peace but also development and providing the basic and the most fundamental human rights, in a way try to achieve some kind of shift in the paradigm to tackle this very important challenge to Africa. She seems to see some kind of specificity for West Africa. I venture not to agree with such distinction of West Africa, and to a certain way to adopt some policy that is tailored, let's say, to West Africa. And I think when addressing drug trafficking with all the relations with the different networks, I think we have countries and government have a lot of common challenges. And I think what is at stake is to not to see it from security lenses only, but to address in a certain sequence, in adopting some priorities, let's say tailored in a certain way when it comes to measures to be taken to each and every situation, because I think the situation in Afghanistan is not the same like in Colombia or like in Pakistan or other countries. So while asserting from these parts of this conference that there are common objectives and common measures that can be taken, there are sometimes some specificities that need to be taken when dealing with this challenge in some parts of the world. I will now give the floor to Jason Elek to give us his take on a very from his different angle, and I would appreciate if, like the other panelists, he will try to do it in the timeline that we have agreed upon, up to 7 minutes. So go ahead, Mr. Jason.
Thank you, Chair. I have a short presentation, so I'd like to share my screen, if I may. I don't know if this is working.
It is. It is.
It is. Excellent. Okay. First, greetings, everyone. It's my pleasure to be part of this discussion. I'd like to address my 7 minutes of remarks very quickly around the issue of drug markets themselves and the importance, I think, in understanding exactly what's going on within domestic drug markets. This is an issue simply because if we're going to develop policy and programs and responses with the intention of interceding or disrupting markets in the process of trying to develop an enduring peace and a resilient population, it's therefore important that we understand exactly what we're looking at. We should know what is being used, how many people are there using, what's the consumer base in our markets, things like how and why and where they're being used, what are the price and distribution characteristics, the fundamental harms. I would suggest then, I'd like to suggest three overriding features. And the first I would like to propose, and maybe I will offend some people, but I believe there's a tendency to overestimate what we think we know about African drug markets. And one of the common features of overestimation are often the use of sweeping generalizations, combining regions and saying this region is like this, or looking at things like seizure statistics. I've used an example here from a report that's going to be presented in the forthcoming CND in Vienna that simply states 99.9% of Captagon is phenethylene hydrochloride. It's an amphetamine type stimulant. So 99.9% of the seizures on the continent occurred in Egypt. Now that statement alone is not necessarily saying what we think it's saying, but it's certainly implying that, for example, phenethylene is an issue just in this place, and therefore by default not necessarily an issue in other markets, which is not necessarily true. We've heard remarks from Julia and Maria Goretti, I think, in their really well done presentations that discuss the issue of trafficking and peace and responding to issues within a region. And when we talk about drugs and drug markets, it's often maps like these here that we see, sweeping arrows pointing to one region, moving across to another region, that really subsume the individual countries within those particular regions. The issue of stereotyping as well is something that's common across markets on the continent. The us versus them. Yes, cannabis, we use cannabis, sure, okay, that's locals, but all the hard drugs, they're either not here, or if they are here, they're used by others, they're used by foreigners, they're not really part of our market. The contradiction in narratives about a particular drug market, I use a couple of examples here from research that we have ongoing. Here, no, we don't have any meth in our country. No, not at all. When in fact, the reality is there's quite a reasonable amount of meth available in the country. Or somebody says there's cocaine here, but it's only the rich people. The narrative is that Africa is a transit location. Drugs don't really stay here. They come and they go, they move through. It's a bit like a bus station for the global drug market, as it were. And that's just not really the case in this particular situation. There was a large amount of crack cocaine in that particular country. So in looking at that, what features do we really know about domestic drug markets in Africa? What is it that we can look at in terms of numbers, in terms of statistics? Well, it's really a gray area, and I think the best place to start would be the United Nations and the data that feeds into their World Drug Report, which is the annual Bible of global drug control, and the UN, of course, the triumvirate of the INCB, the CND, and UNODC is the heart of global drug policy, as it were, in terms of what ought to be done to address drug markets. Here we see a map that's been drawn from World Drug Report data from last year that shows what has been reported to the UN in terms of prevalence of any drug in a country, and we can see that we have data from 30 of the countries across the continent. There are a few gray spots, but really, what do we know within these data? So if we were looking at prevalence of something like cannabis, of course, everybody knows that cannabis is the African drug, even though it ironically originates in Asia. We actually know very little about cannabis use in terms of prevalence across the country, and those numbers that we have in the report that do come through are quite old. We see numbers here from 2010, 2004, and other years being the most recent data available on file in the UN. Cocaine, we have a similar issue, that the yellow countries are countries where data exists, gray, no data. There's a lot of gray going on in the continent. There's a lot that we really don't know. But if we move on to maybe just use instead of prevalence, which is quite statistically advanced in many places, what about use? Do we know what is being used and where it's being used? These are two maps also from the World Drug Report. And I'm not trying to pick on the UN here. I'm simply using this as one example. Examples could come from a variety of sources. And you see Africa within the yellow circle there. And we see, again, an awful lot of gray in terms of, do we know what kind of opioids are used commonly in countries, or do we know what kind of stimulants are used? And you can see how much gray exists on the continent of Africa versus the rest of the world, which is largely colored in terms of, yes, we have an idea of what's going on. And that's something that's repeated as well when we look specifically at market characteristics like price. Do we know how much things cost? Do we know what is available in terms of purity? These are all elements that are important in understanding what is happening in a drug market in a country. What substances exist? How are they moving? And here you can see that the green areas are the most recent data available at the time of publication, which was 2018. But the yellow areas are problematic in and of themselves. And this is because there's not a lot of data that comes out of Africa in terms of reporting, in terms of gray. Policy takeaways. We've got to embrace the principles when we talk about drug policy of, we don't know what we don't know in terms of drug markets, that there's a lot out there that we believe we know, but we don't really know, and we can't see what we're not looking for. The absence of data doesn't mean the absence of harm, and missing data do in fact exist out there. Very quickly, the second issue, we overestimate our potential for disrupting markets. We've spoken a bit about drug control and seizures and the paradox that as seizures go up, prices have over the last 20 years continued to go down and purity goes up. Globally, despite the almost 2.5 decades of the global plan run out of the UN for drug control, production continues to increase, as does use. And even if we look at COVID, what was anticipated to be one of the single greatest disruptors for supply chain distribution of illicit drugs around the world, we can see here data that we've gathered from monitoring the drug market in South Africa, that in fact prices there decreased. And I can tell you that that use didn't decrease alongside that as well. Use was stable through the period. So there was no grand disruption. There was no spike in price because supplies vanished. In terms of small takeaways in that sense, there's no universal or singular policy solution. There's no silver bullet. We can't say if we want to control drug markets and drugs and the harms within these markets, we have to do this one thing. There's a variety of things that have to be considered, and they've got to be considered upon the evidence of fact in terms of what is occurring in the market. Who sets the priorities? Is it foreign affairs? Is it health, law enforcement? Who decides what the drug policy will be? There was a conflict in the UNGAS in 2016, in particular, between the position of the African Union, which was the consensus common African position, and what in fact was said and presented by the Africa group of the UN at the same meeting. And I think that's important. Are we speaking as one? Are we united? When we have a united position, why aren't we united behind it? And what use is the presence of relevant market knowledge and the political will to change and maybe a new policy or a new approach and plan if there's no money to fund it? And that's a huge problem when we look at the continent, is trying to fund the programs that we've put in place, good programs that do exist. Finally, and my last slide, let's not continue to underestimate our ability to be better. I have two quotes here which outline the directions in front of us. The first is a quote by the former president of the INCB, Werner Sipp, and his quote very much, which was given at the UNGAS in 2016 in New York, he was chastising member states and telling them the solution is not new approaches. The solution is to try harder at what we're doing. The reason we're not succeeding is we're not trying hard enough. The quote on the bottom is by former President Motlanthe and former President Obasanjo late last year, who tell us that no, in fact, that's not the answer. The answer is that we must question the certainties that are presented to us. We must not repeat the mistakes that we've been making in terms of drug control in these areas. So our future in terms of drug policy and the consideration therein are in two directions, really. Are we going to try harder at what we've been doing and failing? Or are we going to question the certainties, indulge the investigation of what is really going on, and then develop new solutions that will respond to that going forward? Thank you.
For a very provocative presentation. I think you asked all of us a question. I may venture to respond to your last question. I would say that despite the absence of data in Africa, we will not underestimate our ability to do better, and we will try harder. With this, I will turn to our last speaker for the day, Professor El Mustafa Razi. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you for this. And I guess my presentation fit very well with the last presentation, because also I'm putting
Mustafa, I'm wondering if you could improve a little bit the audio, because we can hardly hear you.
Okay. Is it fine now? Not yet. Let me check this. Now, is it okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, thank you. I guess my presentation fit very well with my previous colleague, Jason, who was speaking about or focusing on data. Definitely, security approach was not able to reduce the impact on fighting against the drug industry. But even taking this issue of security governance between South and North, data issue remain critical issue to discuss. So, well, I guess that one of the issues today we are concerned about, it seems to be, at least it's a methodological concern related to how we can master an efficient tool of risk assessment, and to which information is a relevant instrument, not only of information on risk in general, including those drugs industry and markets, but also information on efforts done by different law enforcement agencies or other institutions working on the issue. Today, I guess that countries facing organized crime differ in their management of information sharing and transparency in their handling of information, either related to these threats or related to what they are providing or what they are doing as efforts. So information sharing today, I guess I might disagree with some views, because we have witnessed during the last 5 years well, a great effort in providing sharing information first with the national public opinion and also with partners. At least in the case of Morocco, we are witnessing, I guess, every year 3 reports coming out on drug industry, one from the police department, second from public ministry, and the third from customer officer department. And the last one was on 2021. We can find all, I mean, the information related to different types of drugs that was subject of law enforcement. Well, regardless of considering the value of information in intelligence management, we have, I guess, one problem that is critical today is how well Northern reports at large, public reports or NGOs reports or think tank reports, they are much more focusing on assessment of risk instead of balancing between information related to risks and information related to efforts. I have one example in my mind, not only related to drugs. For instance, when we talk about that the police department or intelligence agencies were able to arrest 209 cell of terrorist groups, it means the no arrest means 209 explosion. So this could be very helpful, I guess, in encouraging those countries concerned by drugs to be more effective and to be encouraged to develop their governance and their transparency to deal with different crimes and risks. One more remark I would like to share, which will depend to another area of interest, is today, I guess, if we would like to make an assessment of well, fighting drugs in the South, at least I will focus on the South, we still have a very weak area, which is not yet well taken into consideration, is the cultural aspect. Today, we can find, and there is 2 or 3 ongoing research today in North Africa and West Africa. We can feel that all efforts, they are ignoring the birth of a subculture which is tolerating criminality, tolerating drugs, tolerating access to violence. And I guess there is nothing has been done, at least in this area. Maybe when experts or those who are working on this area might contribute to make it more relevant, because in my understanding, to fight the criminality is important, but to fight against the, how we say, the acceptance of criminality is much more crucial issue. I thank you.
Well, I thank Professor Razrazi for his very, very brief presentation, but I thank him also for addressing the issue of data from the Moroccan point of view. I received few questions that I would like to share with our distinguished panelists. I have received so far 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions. I hope we will have enough time to satisfy everybody. First question, how could one build sustainable peace in areas where governance is undermined by drug networks? How would such agreements, peace agreement meaning, be enforced? I will repeat the first question so that everybody will take note of. How could one build sustainable peace in areas where governance is undermined by drug networks? How would such agreements, peace agreements, be enforced? Second question, were existing drug control policies coherent with the goal of building peace? How to implement peace accords that are threatened by the implementation of stringent drug control laws? Third question, could any lessons be drawn from other attempts to scale down violence by addressing how illicit economies fund or motivate armed conflicts? Fourth question, what is the impact of COVID on the spread of drug trafficking and the effectiveness of public policies in combating drug trafficking? And finally, the final question is about the plan of action of the African Union 2019-2023. One of those who are listening to us is asking, what is what are the measures that are contemplated in this plan of action in order to address the issue of drug trafficking in peace-building times? So these are the questions. If you need me to repeat some of them, please feel free to ask me too. If not, I will give the floor to whom is volunteered to break the ice and begin addressing these questions.
Okay, so I don't know whether I can come in. I would like to.
Anne-Maria. Anne-Maria, go ahead.
Probably the drug trafficking and other issues within the region. If you look at the, let me see, 3 key areas. It talks about the fact that countries will need to focus on these specific areas, not neglecting other areas like we have done over time. It talks about the fact that countries will have to consider harm reduction. Countries must focus on demand reduction. some of the issues arising from drug trafficking. It's about the fact that we need a comprehensive approach in addressing. We neglect many aspects like we have done over time. That will mean that certain key areas will not be taken care of in terms of some of the emergence of the problems we are having as a region. Because as a region, we're not just a transit zone. We are kind of like, we are consuming, we are producing cannabis and all that. And so there are emergent threats in terms of health, public health. There are emergent threats in terms of lack of availability of resources to implement harm reduction and broadening the service provision. So if you look at the plan of action, of course, it still talks about the fact that we need to, as a region, we need to pay attention to drug trafficking and security issues, but countries must also focus on providing services and putting in a lot of resources to address the consumption part of drugs. Because if you look at many governments across the region, they have failed woefully to put in measures to address the issues emerging as a result of people consuming drugs. And so this is something that I feel African Union has done pretty very well in terms of the plan of action. And it is a call on governments to try and look at their legislations, which are the key problems within the region, because many of the legislations are an obstacle to making these things happen. And so, of course, it's a call that we need legislative reforms. We need to take that, I mean, governments must have that political will to undertake the steps that they need to address those specific issues. So for us to be able to address the problem in the continent effectively, of course, we have to go by the comprehensive approach that the African Union is calling on us to do.
Thank you, Anne-Maria, for addressing the questions, specific question on the plan of action. You have noticed that I did not ask each and every one of you to address each and every question. I think it would have been time consuming, but it's up to our panelists to pick up the questions that they would like to respond to.
I can address the COVID question very quickly if that's okay.
Yes, Jason, please. Go ahead.
Good question, and I think something that is out there. 3 points. One, when COVID first started, there were a lot of projections that supply would be interrupted or stop, production would stop in terms of the various drugs, and markets would be significantly disrupted, and there would be a serious impact on organized criminal groups involved in drug trafficking. The reality is, no, there's been no significant change as a result of COVID. Production has continued, and there have been no reduction in use. Really, the only COVID measure that's had any impact in domestic markets has been the issue of a curfew, and dealers and distributors have found a way around that. There have been some changes in distribution. Ports being exploited have changed, but the flow continues, and the markets are continuing to be robust. So I think while this is a good example of we think we know what we know in advance of the crisis occurring, in reality, evidence on the ground demonstrates that, in fact, this is not the case. Finally, as a point of an example, we've seen earlier this week in South Africa, the seizure of a ton of cocaine. In January in the Gambia, there were 3 tons of cocaine seized. There have been several very high-profile seizures occurring on the continent in the last 4 to 5 months. I will tell you this, that anytime you see a large seizure, a ton, multiple tons, that's not the first time that those drugs have moved through that channel. There's no way a network is moving large quantities of drugs through a channel unless first, A, it's been tested, and B, it's been proven to be a success. So by the time you get around to seizing a ton or more in a particular area, you've not disrupted a new flow. You've identified an old flow that will eventually soon change if seizures continue. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Jason. And I agree with you that sometimes the seizure is an opportunity for the networks exactly to adjust their strategy and to see that these are the weaknesses so that we can switch to something else. And there is always the gymnastics between authorities and the networks that is extremely harmful to any drug policy. Any Julia maybe, or Mr. Al-Mustafa, who could address one of the 4 or 3 remaining questions?
I can certainly add a couple of very brief sentences, and I think Khaled also wanted to come in and make a couple of quick comments. Just first of all, I mean, there was a talk earlier about, well, you know, let's not homogenize experiences and let's be a bit more sophisticated in the way that we understand different country reactions to international drug economies. The problem is that we don't live in a situation where we can have these kind of sui generis tailored responses, because the international system of drug control, and this is actually a bit of a discussion we have missed here, this is an international framework. This is a series of drug treaty conventions, you know, that some of these are over 100 years old. So, you know, when we're talking about these problems with metrics and data and trying to have refined policies, to me, the real challenge goes back to the fact that we are living with a totally arcane and unsophisticated series of international treaties. The other couple of points that I wanted to make in response to some of the comments: can we scale down violence by focusing on illicit economies? Will that help us then to reduce conflict? Well, this is all very 2000s. We kind of went through this in the 2000s, where it was the Taliban is funded by the heroin trade, the FARC is funded by the cocaine trade. I think we have to move on from that, and we have to really engage with the fact that it's not illicit economies that themselves are fueling conflict. There are also underlying structural drivers of conflict. And in so many of these cases, those countries we're talking about, these are profound inequalities. These are massive inequalities in access to land, to credit, to capital, to investment. Unless we start dealing with these issues of inequalities and massive land inequalities and political exclusion, there's no point of simply focusing on an illicit economy and thinking if we deal with that specific illicit commodity, we're going to end conflicts. It's simply not going to happen. The final thing I just wanted to mention also, there was a question here, you know, is peace building and very robust drug laws incompatible? Of course they are. We can't have peace building where we have these really robust, coercive, rights abusing drug policies. They are completely incompatible. This is what we discuss in the edited collection. So, of course, governance is going to be undermined by networks that are reliant on illicit economies. But the point is, let's not give these networks another illicit commodity to put in their portfolio, things that fund violence and conflict. Why create this massive multi-billion-dollar industry because of an approach that is now over 100 years old? It's time we grew up and acknowledged some of these challenges and the immense poverty and the immense rights abuses that are associated with strategies that have failed. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Maybe Mustafa, who is here? Mr. Azrazi, do you have some elements to answer?
I don't have that much to say, but just for 2 elements, if possible. One related to the COVID time. I guess at least I did have the chance to follow up with the Moroccan Association of Addictology, their report on the 2020, and they have raised that such issues that well, the consuming of hard drugs were reduced, but we have found that moving to psychotrope, for instance, was increased. In terms of prices, there was not that much changes, but definitely the transnational drug crimes were reduced because of the lockdown and the warning system of different security departments because of the COVID, not because of the drugs, was a relevant factor that have show a huge impact in terms of the annual assessment. Thank you.
Maybe let me come back when we talk about the drug trafficking and peace building, maybe to focus on the specificity of countries that are in the process of the peace building. Okay, these countries are in the they have to give top priority to security of the people. They have to give priority to securing their borders. 3, they have to maybe finance by their own national means the small projects that are envisaged in any peace building activity. There is a shortage of external assistance when it comes to development, when it comes to peace building. So how can we expect these fragile states who are trying, first of all, to ensure the minimum conditions for stability, at the same time be very effective in combating drug trafficking, knowing that the financial, sometimes the military means that the armed groups that are disturbing peace and security are much more higher and more important than the ones who are in the position of the government. That's what is that the question that come to my mind. So when we talk about not a sui generis approach, we only asking for, when it comes to African countries, to take into considerations the sensitivity of the political process, the fact that maybe you have some networks that are dealing with drug trafficking or actors in a possible peace, how to attract them, how to delegitimize their relation with civilian population. I think these are the questions that compels us to tackle the issue of peace building in a way that is not exactly the same like in other countries. I think that Khalid wanted also to share with us some consideration. Please feel free to do so.
Thank you, Shukran, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and thank you for this incredible debate. I just wanted to bring in some elements, being a proud Moroccan citizen working on drug policy here in Switzerland and globally. The idea of the discussion also here goes from the point of view of what the international community had agreed upon when putting in place that international regime for during 30 years, since 1961 until 1988, and then deploying it through political declarations where countries agree. It was to eliminate drugs from the world or significantly reduce their presence. And that was an objective that has been confirmed for 2008 and then been reconfirmed from 2019. Sorry. And so, but in the meantime, there was a UN general session, a special session, especially after the war on drugs of Mexico and the Calderon administration attack and the Kingpin strategy that they followed up in Mexico in 2006 that have created so many, what the UN calls unintended negative consequences on development, be it from over-incarceration to, as the colleagues have been speaking on the impact of public health, to the issues of aggravating the issues of poverty on certain communities, et cetera, and of security issues, of course, because at the end of the day, we can also see, as Maria Goretti was talking about silos, that, for example, the UN missions for peace that depend on the UN Department for Peace and Political Affairs can't even track the illicit financial flows. And I think that the Global Initiative on Transnational Organized Crime talks more beautifully about it and in deep analysis. So, I mean, here the question is that no one ever questions from research, from communities, no one questions the efforts and the goodwill of authorities to make people safer. It is, what is questioned is the tools that have been used, and quite blindly, when we even have the data now of just the last 20 years, and we see that nothing has been reduced, it's been increasing and all the time. And of course, Morocco, our country, is one of the best in data collection and has been very transparent and putting out even data that is not good, like maternal and child mortality, for example, and we put it out there. It's not good for the country, but we do that and we share all the information. Nevertheless, how data is collected, as Julia said, is flawed in itself, because it's about seizures, it's about people that are touched by the system, for instance, people that are arrested or go to emergency rooms, etc. So it is about finding a middle way, and that's why we try to bridge all of this through the discussion of development. And you have asked a very interesting question at the very beginning, Mr. Ambassador, that was about where is all these efforts of legalization put in the middle of addressing trafficking. My organization calls, of course, for the legal regulation, because legalization can mean over-commercialization, can mean many things, but having strict regulations on a market means putting the state in control for the very first time. The state will never retake control of the drugs market. It will take control of it for the very first time, as we are doing in Morocco with the medical and industrial legalization of cannabis, fortunately. So, I mean, and just to finish up, sorry if this has taken some time, to say that also the international cooperation has been limited also on this issue. I mean, of course, the health and well-being of citizens is a sovereign issue, and so people have to deal with their citizens the way they want. I mean, providing the health services, I mean, harm reduction, evidence-based treatment, evidence-based prevention services, etc., and safety of the neighborhoods and evidence-based, based on the rights, on the basic rights of people. Those are all issues that do not need international cooperation. Countries can do them as long as, of course, they're respectful of their commitments to human rights mechanisms. Nevertheless, at the international level, on the supply reduction side, it has been very limited into judicial cooperation about extraditions, about money laundering, and about, and we know that, for example, tracking down money does not work. Europol speaks about 90% of all the revenues being laundered in Europe never being recovered. So we see, so basically here we're talking about a really, really big issue where the more we try to enforce, the more harms we find on social, cultural, and political issues at the same time. And so this is where it's very hard. It's how to get out of 60 years of interest in interlinked and at many levels of flawed policies because of the very early aim of elimination, which was not realistic to some extent. And this is where we found ourselves in these situations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Khalid, for anticipating on my last questions. You took everything from me. I wanted to ask all our colleagues. We have only 5 minutes. My question was going to be the following. Do you consider that the legalization is going to have as an effect a curse or a blessing for the international effort in order to curb the drug trafficking? I think you can each and one of you can answer in 1 or 2 minutes, and this I think will be considered as a wrapping up of our webinar this afternoon. And if we could finish by a positive note, I think it's more than welcome.
Well, I'll just kick off and say I would very much doubt that decriminalization, legalization, and the many things we can do in between those policies would necessarily lead to a reduction in conflict and violence, because the whole point is that there are other facets of the formal and the informal economy that can fuel conflict and violent crime. But what decriminalization and legalization would do is it would reduce the immense unintended consequences, the immense harms, and it would enable us to lead with a public health approach.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia. Let's go to maybe Jason. just in one sentence or.
Sure. Just to continue from Julia's point, I think if we look at legalization as a solution to transnational organized crime and criminal networks, I don't think that's something that's necessarily going to lead to success in that sense. But the example of Canada and its legalization of cannabis has seen certainly an impact on the share that organized criminal groups have had on the illicit supply of cannabis and the illicit cannabis market. But the trade-off, of course, is that unless we address the underlying factors that are supporting these groups and enabling them and embedding them in many cases, legalizing one commodity or a series of commodities is simply going to encourage them to seek opportunity in commodities in another way. I'll give, for example, cigarettes and alcohol and the smuggling that continues to exist around them as one example of groups adapting to change.
Do I understand that the result will depend if we have democracy and good governance on one side, and less or absence of good governance and democracy in other? Let's ask maybe the remaining panelists maybe to integrate this aspect in their answers if it's possible. Mustafa, go ahead.
So I perfectly agree with Jason and Professor Julia, in the sense that legalization, decriminalization, legal regulation, in my opinion, are ways of defunding the criminal groups. We are indirectly taking that the monies we have always made them to hold on to in terms of creating that criminal market for them to benefit from. So basically, by decriminalizing, by legally regulating drugs, governments will have to take control of these substances and regulate them appropriately to the benefit of society, other than creating the current situation where we have continually given more money to the criminal networks to be able to become more powerful and perpetuate the things that we are seeing in society. So if governments are in position to legislate policies that will address these fundamental issues in terms of decriminalization, legal regulation, I believe that we will be able to address most of the challenges that we currently have with our policies. And so it is for us, for governments to be able to drive this process and be able to take control of many of the challenges. We need to take these steps. They are necessary and they are timely. We need to undertake them to be able to address most of the challenges that we are facing as a continent.
Thank you, Maria. Mustafa?
Thank you. Definitely, I mean, regulating these industries should be very beneficial to monitor and how to deal with it. Either it has to do with the consuming aspect, the production, the handling, but I do believe personally, as a citizen, as an individual, that such topics requires also to go beyond experts and to go back to a public debate, to go to community, to listen to the community, because we cannot just, under the pretext that we are experts, we hijack such issues because they are very critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Mustafa. If Khalid would like to maybe say something, otherwise I will conclude this.
No, thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Just to say that I agree with Dr. Razrazi. Of course, the experts are in bringing the data and the information and the analysis, but this is also a societal debate, of course, because it touches all social classes, genders, all ages, all regions around the world. And of course, it needs to be in a process where people can meet together and put all the stakeholders around the table. That's key, actually, because everyone has to find consensus. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid. And let me end this webinar by saying that all the pleasure that I took, honestly, to moderate this very exciting discussion about a very timely topic. I hope that our audience enjoyed this discussion as we did. And I thank them for the questions, for the interest and the question that they addressed to the panelists. I hope that this partnership with our colleagues from Geneva and with all these experts will continue. Policy Center of the New South is a think tank that is trying to bring the African narrative to all the global issues. And we are very pleased to see that this confrontation of ideas help all of us to understand much better the different views and the different stakes in a very complex and very difficult and challenging topics. Thank you to all of you, and I hope that you will keep safe. And I hope that the next time we will do that not through microphones and through the new technology, but by your physical presence, whether here in Geneva or elsewhere. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.